Ethan Holloway planned to spend exactly 20 minutes inside the farmhouse his late wife had forbidden him from visiting during all 23 years of their marriage. He intended to unlock the front door, photograph the rooms for the realtor in Madison, and finally sell the isolated property Claire Holloway had disappeared to every third Saturday for most of their life together. That was all. But 4 seconds after he stepped into the foyer, an older woman sitting at the kitchen table slowly stood and looked at him with the exhausted calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. "You finally came," she said quietly. Ethan tightened his grip on the truck keys in his hand. "I think you've mistaken me for somebody else." The woman shook her head. "No, Claire told me you would come eventually." The words made his stomach tighten. Claire had been dead for 6 months. Pancreatic cancer, 52 years old. Buried beneath a gray November sky outside Cedar Grove Lutheran Church, while Ethan stood beside her grave, unable to understand how a woman could disappear so completely from the world after occupying every corner of his life for 23 years. The woman turned toward the living room, visible beyond the hallway. Then she spoke the sentence Ethan would spend the rest of his life trying to recover from. "This is Noah," she said softly. "He's Claire's son. He's been waiting his whole life to meet you." Ethan looked into the living room. A wheelchair sat beside the window. The man in it was not a child, but a grown man whose body had been twisted by severe cerebral palsy into angles Ethan's mind struggled to process all at once. One arm curled tightly against his chest. His legs rested beneath a blanket despite the warmth of the morning. But none of that was what hit Ethan hardest. It was the eyes, gray-green. Claire's eyes. The man looked directly at him across the hallway and made a trembling sound deep in his throat, like someone trying to speak through years of waiting. On the side table beside the wheelchair sat a framed photograph. It was Ethan, a picture Claire had taken of him years earlier during a summer picnic in Madison. The older woman stepped closer to the wheelchair and rested a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "Noah," she whispered, "this is Ethan. This is the man your mother married." And in that moment, standing inside the farmhouse Claire had forbidden him from entering for 23 years, Ethan realized his wife had died with an entire hidden life still locked inside her. "My name is Ethan Holloway. I am 54 years old, and until 7 months ago, I believed I understood the woman I married better than anyone else alive. I was wrong. For 26 years, I owned an appliance repair business in Madison, Wisconsin. I repaired washing machines, refrigerators, dryers, and ovens for people who usually called only when something inside their homes stopped working unexpectedly. I drove a white Ford F-150 with rust along the rear wheel wells and enough mileage on the engine to make my mechanic shake his head every winter. My life was ordinary in the way most good lives are ordinary. Claire liked that about me. She once told me, during our 2nd year of marriage, that I made the world feel stable. At the time, I thought it was one of the kindest things anybody had ever said to me. Now I wonder if stability was simply the thing she needed most, because her own life had never truly been stable at all. Claire worked as a bookkeeper at a mid-sized accounting firm in downtown Madison. She was organized, quiet, careful with money, and deeply private in ways I stopped questioning after enough years passed. Every 3rd Saturday of every month, she left before sunrise, always alone, always carrying the same brown leather overnight bag. She would drive 3 hours east to Jefferson County and return sometime Sunday evening, exhausted in a way that seemed deeper than physical tiredness. When I asked where she went during the 1st year of our marriage, she kissed my cheek and said gently, "It's family business, Ethan." The second time I asked, she said, Please don't make me explain something I can't explain. I never asked again. 23 years teaches a person which doors inside a marriage remain closed. 6 months after Claire died, Attorney Charles Whitaker called me to his office in Milwaukee. He handed me a manila envelope, a ring of farmhouse keys, and documents establishing a medical trust worth nearly $800,000. I remember staring at him across the polished desk. "What exactly is this?" I asked. Charles removed his glasses slowly. "Your wife wanted you to read the letter before visiting the property." "What property?" "The farmhouse in Jefferson County." I laughed once under my breath. "The place she never let me see?" "Yes." Something in his expression made my stomach tighten. "She kept more from you than the farmhouse, Mr. Holloway." I should have opened the letter right there in his office. Instead, I drove 3 hours through winding county roads until I reached the white farmhouse standing alone beyond a gravel driveway lined with maple trees. The house looked lived in. Fresh paint, wheelchair ramp, smoke rising from the chimney. I sat inside my truck for nearly 5 minutes staring at the front porch, while a terrible feeling slowly spread through my chest. Then I got out. I walked up the ramp. I opened the front door, and my entire life changed forever. I do not remember sitting down at the kitchen table. One moment, I was standing frozen in the hallway, staring at the man in the wheelchair. And the next, I was sitting across from the older woman while a cup of black coffee cooled untouched between my hands. The farmhouse kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon, old wood, and something simmering slowly in a crock-pot somewhere deeper in the house. It smelled lived in, comfortable, not abandoned, not forgotten. The woman finally sat across from me and folded her hands together carefully. "My name is Ruth Delgado," she said. "I've been caring for Noah for 22 years. I looked toward the living room. Noah was still watching me, not in the cautious way strangers usually watch each other, but with a kind of open recognition that made my chest tighten painfully. His body looked fragile beneath the blanket covering his legs. One shoulder leaned sharply to the side. His fingers twitched against the armrest of the wheelchair, with movements he clearly could not fully control. But his eyes never left my face. Claire's eyes. I swallowed hard. "You said he's Claire's son." Ruth nodded once. "Yes." "That's impossible." Even as I said it, the words sounded weak. Ruth glanced down at the coffee mug in front of her. "Claire gave birth to Noah when she was 16 years old." The room became very quiet. Outside the kitchen window, wind moved softly through the trees lining the gravel driveway. Somewhere farther away, I heard the low sound of cattle from a neighboring dairy farm. I stared at Ruth. She never told me she had a child. She never told almost anyone. I pressed my palms against the edge of the table. How is that possible? We were married 23 years. Ruth's expression carried no judgment, only exhaustion. Because Claire spent most of her life believing silence was the same thing as survival. She explained it slowly. Claire grew up in a strict immigrant household outside Fairmont Ridge. Her parents, Harold and Evelyn Bennett, believed family shame was something carried privately and permanently. When 16-year-old Claire became pregnant by a machinist named Scott Mercer, the situation nearly destroyed the family. Scott visited the hospital once after Noah was born. Then he disappeared. Moved to Tucson, Arizona 3 weeks later. Never came back. "And Noah?" I asked quietly. "Complications during delivery," Ruth said softly. "Severe cerebral palsy." I closed my eyes briefly. When I opened them again, Noah was still watching me from the living room. Ruth continued. "Claire's parents made her promise never to tell anyone about him. Not friends, not future relationships, nobody." "That's insane." "Yes," Ruth said, but Claire was 16 years old and terrified. I stood suddenly and walked to the sink, gripping the counter with both hands. 23 years. 23 years of marriage. Birthdays. Anniversaries, quiet Sunday mornings drinking coffee together in our kitchen. And somehow, beneath all of it existed another entire life I had never seen. Behind me, Ruth spoke gently. She tried to tell you more times than you know. I turned around slowly. What? Ruth hesitated. She talked about you constantly after she married you. She loved you very much, Ethan. The anger rising inside me twisted painfully against the grief already living there. People don't keep secrets like this from someone they love. Ruth looked toward Noah before answering. Claire spent so long carrying the secret that eventually she no longer knew how to put it down. At that moment, Noah made a soft sound from the living room. Ruth stood immediately and walked to him. She adjusted the blanket over his legs and touched his shoulder gently. "Noah," she whispered. "It's okay." He kept staring at me. Then he slowly lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward the photograph beside his chair. The picture was 11 years old. Claire had taken it during a company picnic near Lake Monona. I was laughing in the photo, happy, completely unaware that somewhere 3 hours away, her son already knew my face. I drove back to Madison just before sunset, with Claire's letter sitting unopened on the passenger seat beside me. The entire 3-hour drive home felt unreal. Every mile of highway seemed divided between two versions of my life. There was the life I thought I had lived with my wife for 23 years, and then there was the life that had apparently existed, hidden beneath it, the entire time. I kept seeing Noah's face, Claire's eyes staring at me from a wheelchair beside the farmhouse window. By the time I reached our ranch house in Brookfield Heights, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The porch light Claire insisted on leaving on every night still glowed softly beside the garage. For 6 months, I had been unable to bring myself to change anything inside the house. Her shoes still sat beside the front closet. Her favorite gray sweater still hung over the kitchen chair. The coffee mug with the chipped handle she refused to throw away still rested in the cabinet above the sink. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time before finally sitting at the table with the envelope Charles Whitaker had handed me. My hands shook opening it. Inside was a letter written in Claire's careful handwriting across 12 yellow legal pages. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you already know about Noah. I am sorry." The words blurred almost immediately. I pressed my hand against my mouth and forced myself to continue. Claire wrote that she had tried many times to tell me the truth. On our second date, the night before our wedding, the morning doctors told us we would never have children together. Every single time, fear stopped her. Not fear that I would leave her. Fear that once the secret existed outside her own body, she would no longer know how to survive carrying it. She explained Noah's birth in painful detail. 16 years old, terrified, alone in a hospital room in Rockford, while her parents refused to speak above whispers because they feared people in town would learn the truth. Then came the sentence that broke something open inside me. "I loved you from the first moment you made me laugh in the grocery store parking lot outside Madison General. And every day after that, I hated myself for what I was keeping from you." I stopped reading. For several minutes, I simply sat there, staring at the kitchen wall, while grief moved through me like physical exhaustion. Then I continued. Claire explained how Noah had lived at the farmhouse for most of his life, under the care of women she trusted more than anyone else in the world. Dorothy Mills first, then Ruth Delgado, then Marlene Hayes. Every third Saturday for 30 years, Claire drove to Jefferson County to spend the weekend with her son. She wrote about reading to him on the porch, feeding him vanilla pudding, while old baseball games played on the radio, holding his hand during thunderstorms, because loud noises frightened him. Then I reached the final pages. "Noah knows your face." The sentence sat alone between paragraphs. "I told him about you for 20 years. He knows your voice from recordings. He knows you repair appliances. He knows you laugh too loudly at football games and cry during sad movies, even though you pretend not to. There was a photograph beside his bed the entire time. A photograph of me. I covered my eyes with both hands. The next line nearly destroyed me completely. He has been waiting his whole life to meet you. By the time I reached the final page, tears were running openly down my face. I am not asking you to become his father, Ethan. I lost the right to ask that from you a very long time ago. I am asking only one thing. Visit him once. Please let my son see the man I loved most before I leave this world. Love does not disappear simply because it was hidden badly. I love you. I always will. Claire. I read the letter 4 times that night. The first time in shock, the second time in anger, the third time in grief, and the 4th time in something quieter and far more painful, understanding. At 5:30 the next morning, I poured coffee into a thermos, put on my old Carhartt jacket, and drove back toward the farmhouse before the sun came up. The second time I drove to the farmhouse, the roads felt different, less like a stranger's route, more like a path someone I loved had traveled so many times that traces of her still lived inside the turns and quiet stretches of highway. Morning fog rested low over the fields outside Riverton as I drove east with Claire's letter folded carefully inside my jacket pocket. The farther I traveled into Jefferson County, the harder it became to breathe normally, because now I understood what those roads had been. They had not been roads leading away from me. They had been roads leading back to her son. I arrived at the farmhouse shortly after 9 in the morning. Ruth opened the front door before I knocked. For the first time since meeting her, she smiled slightly. I thought you might come back. I nodded once. Noah sat near the front window in the same wheelchair, sunlight falling across the blanket covering his legs. When he saw me, his eyes widened immediately. Then came the sound again, that soft, trembling sound deep in his throat. Recognition. Something inside my chest tightened painfully. Ruth helped Noah adjust the tray attached to his wheelchair, while I sat beside him, awkwardly, uncertain what people were supposed to say in moments like this. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting inside me all night. How did Claire manage all this alone? Ruth became quiet, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and began telling me the story my wife never could. Claire's parents died less than a year after Noah was born. Head-on collision during a rainstorm on Interstate 94. Claire was 17 years old with a severely disabled infant and almost no money. She nearly broke, Ruth said softly. Claire moved into a tiny apartment in Rockford and worked evenings while caring for Noah during the day. She barely slept. Noah's medical complications became more difficult as he grew older. There were feeding problems, muscle seizures, endless hospital visits. She stopped talking to most people, Ruth said. Your wife spent years surviving, one day at a time. Then Ruth told me something that made my stomach drop. At 22, Claire attempted suicide. I stared at her, silently. She swallowed a bottle of prescription pills, Ruth continued quietly. A social worker named Susan Keller found her in time. I leaned back slowly in the chair. The woman I married had carried enough pain to try ending her life once, and I never even suspected it. Susan Keller changed everything after that. She helped Claire apply for disability assistance for Noah. She found in-home care workers. She convinced Claire to move back into the farmhouse, where living costs were lower, and Noah had space for medical equipment. That farmhouse saved both of them, Ruth said. Claire began rebuilding her life carefully. Bookkeeping classes, part-time accounting work, long drives between Madison and Jefferson County, and eventually, me. When she met you, Ruth said, I think she finally understood what happiness felt like again. The words hurt more than they comforted. Then why keep lying to me? Ruth looked toward Noah before answering, because by then, the secret had become part of her bones. Noah suddenly made another sound and shifted slightly in his wheelchair. Ruth stood immediately. He wants the newspaper. The newspaper? He liked when Claire read to him every Saturday morning. Ruth handed me the folded Madison paper sitting on the counter. For a second, I hesitated. Then I carried it into the living room and sat beside Noah. He watched me carefully while I opened the paper with trembling hands. I began reading an article about rising gas prices in Dane County. Halfway through the article, Noah relaxed, visibly. His breathing slowed, and for the first time since Claire died, I understood exactly where she had been every third Saturday of our marriage. I started returning to the farmhouse every weekend, without fully deciding to. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I would help organize Claire's paperwork, understand the trust Charles Whitaker managed, maybe spend a little time getting to know Noah before deciding what came next. But by the third Saturday, I realized something uncomfortable. I was planning my entire week around those drives to Jefferson County. The farmhouse itself had begun changing in my mind. During the first visit, it felt like a crime scene left behind by my marriage. By the fourth, it felt strangely familiar. Claire's presence lived everywhere inside it. In the stack of neatly folded blankets beside Noah's chair, in the vanilla pudding cups lining the refrigerator shelf, in the collection of baseball magazines beside the sofa. Every object inside the farmhouse carried fingerprints of the woman I thought I had known. Ruth and Marlene slowly began teaching me Noah's routines. Breakfast at 7:30, medication at 8, newspaper reading afterward, television only during thunderstorms or difficult afternoons. Noah liked old game shows, soft music, and open windows when the weather was warm enough. He hated loud vacuum cleaners. He loved hearing birds outside the porch screens. He likes patterns, Ruth explained one morning while helping Noah eat oatmeal. Predictable things make him feel safe. I nodded quietly. Claire must have known that, which meant for 30 years she built her life around protecting those patterns. The realization followed me constantly. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing alone inside Claire's old office upstairs. The room overlooked the back pasture, where sunlight moved slowly across the grass in long golden strips. There were shelves filled with binders dating back decades, medical paperwork, care schedules, expense records, everything organized with Claire's careful handwriting. 30 years of hidden motherhood stored neatly inside filing cabinets. I opened one drawer and froze. Photographs, hundreds of them. Noah at different ages. Noah smiling beside birthday cakes. Claire sitting beside his wheelchair during Christmas mornings. And me. Photographs of me clipped carefully into albums I had never seen before. Me fixing the backyard grill. Me asleep on the couch during football games. Me standing in our kitchen, holding coffee. My throat tightened painfully. Claire had been bringing pieces of my life here for years. That evening, Ruth made chicken soup, while Noah sat beside the kitchen window, watching rain slide slowly down the glass. I sat across from him, holding one of the photo albums. "You knew who I was," I said quietly. Noah made the sound again. Ruth smiled softly from the stove. That sound means he recognizes something important. I looked at Noah. All this time? Another sound. His eyes never left my face. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then something happened that nearly broke me apart completely. Noah reached toward me. The movement was slow and unsteady, his hand trembling badly as his arms struggled against muscles that refused to cooperate properly. But the intention was unmistakable. He was reaching for me. Instinctively, I leaned forward and took his hand carefully in mine. His fingers curled weakly against my wrist. And suddenly, I understood something horrifying. For 20 years, this man had known my name, known my face, known my voice through recordings Claire secretly played for him. Meanwhile, I had never known he existed. The guilt hit me so hard, I had to look away. That night, after Noah fell asleep, I walked alone onto the farmhouse porch, while crickets filled the darkness around the fields. Rainwater still dripped slowly from the roof. I sat on the porch steps, exactly where Claire must have sat hundreds of nights before me. Then, for the first time since her funeral, I cried hard enough that I could barely breathe. Not because Claire lied to me, not even because she hid Noah. I cried because she carried all of it alone for so long that eventually she forgot another person could have helped her carry it too. The longer I stayed connected to Noah's world, the more my marriage began rearranging itself inside my memory. Small moments I had ignored for years suddenly carried entirely different meanings. Claire insisting we keep separate savings accounts. Claire freezing whenever conversations turned toward children. Claire sitting silently beside the passenger window during long drives home from family gatherings where relatives asked why we never started a family of our own. At the time, I thought she was simply private. Now I understood. She had been terrified. Every memory hurt differently after that realization. One Thursday evening, nearly 2 months after discovering Noah, I sat alone in our Madison house, staring at an old photograph from our honeymoon in Door County. Claire was smiling in the picture, but now I noticed something I had missed before: exhaustion. Even back then, even at 29 years old, part of her already looked tired from carrying too much alone. I drove to see Margaret Whitmore the following weekend. Claire's aunt lived in a small white house outside Pine Hollow, surrounded by overgrown rose bushes and bird feeders hanging from the porch roof. She opened the door slowly, leaning heavily against a cane. For several seconds, we simply looked at each other. "You know," I finally said. Margaret nodded once. "I've known since Noah was born." The honesty of it hit me harder than anger would have. Inside, her house smelled faintly of peppermint tea and old books. Family photographs lined the walls. I noticed immediately there were almost no pictures of Claire displayed openly. Margaret saw me looking. She didn't want questions. We sat together at the kitchen table, while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the floorboards. "I need to understand something," I said quietly. "Why keep this secret after her parents died? Why continue lying for decades?" Margaret was silent a long time before answering. "Because promises made young sometimes become prisons." I looked down at my hands. "She could have trusted me." "She did trust you." The words came sharply. "She loved you more deeply than you realize, Ethan." "Then why shut me out?" Margaret's eyes softened with sadness. "Because Claire believed telling you would destroy the life she finally built." I shook my head slowly. "That doesn't make sense." "It did to her." Margaret explained how Claire spent years convinced she was damaged beyond repair. Having Noah so young, losing her parents, nearly ending her own life, all of it shaped how she viewed herself. "She thought happiness was temporary," Margaret said softly. "And she thought if you ever saw the whole truth, you would eventually leave." I leaned back heavily in the chair. "She underestimated me." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "But she also underestimated herself." That sentence stayed with me long after I left. On the drive back to Madison, rain rolled steadily across the windshield, while memories kept surfacing one after another. Claire crying quietly in the bathroom after fertility treatments failed. Claire refusing expensive vacations. Claire sitting awake at night, balancing spreadsheets at the kitchen table. For years I believed those moments came from stress. Now I understood. They came from responsibility. The next morning, I visited Claire's grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery outside Cedar Grove Lutheran Church sat empty beneath low gray clouds. Wet grass soaked through my boots as I stood staring at the headstone bearing her name. Claire Elizabeth Holloway, beloved wife. The word wife suddenly felt painfully incomplete. "You should have told me," I whispered aloud. Wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the cemetery. For several seconds, anger rose inside me again. Not loud anger, the quieter kind. The kind built from realizing your entire marriage contained rooms you were never allowed to enter. Then another thought came immediately after. Claire had not hidden Noah because she didn't love me. She hid him because fear had become the foundation beneath every decision she made. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since learning the truth, I no longer felt only betrayed. I felt heartbroken for her too. 3 months after I first walked into the farmhouse, my life existed in 2 separate places. During the week, I still lived in Madison. I repaired ovens, replaced refrigerator compressors, and answered customer calls inside the appliance shop I had owned for over 2 decades. At night, I returned to the empty ranch house Claire and I once shared, heated canned soup for dinner, and sat alone in rooms that no longer felt entirely real. Then, every Friday morning, I drove east to Jefferson County, and every Sunday night, leaving the farmhouse felt harder. Not because of the house itself, because of Noah. By then, I understood the rhythms of his life almost as well as Ruth and Marlene did. I knew the sounds he made when he was tired, frustrated, amused, or content. I knew he liked listening to baseball games through a small radio beside the porch swing. I knew thunderstorms frightened him unless someone sat nearby and kept talking calmly through the worst of the lightning. Most dangerously of all, I had started caring whether he was happy. That frightened me more than anything. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Charles Whitaker called the appliance shop. "We need to discuss the future of the trust," he said carefully. I drove to Milwaukee the next morning. Charles sat behind the same polished desk where he first handed me Claire's letter months earlier. This time the folders spread across his desk looked thicker, more permanent. "The trust contains enough funds to continue Noah's current care for years," Charles explained. "But long-term management becomes more complicated if the property remains privately occupied." I frowned. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying eventually decisions will need to be made." "Like what?" Charles removed his glasses slowly. "Whether Noah should transition into professional residential care." The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Residential care. A facility, bright hallways, rotating nurses, strangers. I immediately pictured Noah sitting alone beside unfamiliar windows, waiting for people who never stayed long enough to learn his sounds properly. Something inside me recoiled from the image. Charles continued carefully. "No one would judge you for making that choice, Ethan. Claire herself understood it might eventually become necessary." I looked down at the paperwork without speaking. Later that afternoon, I met realtor Rebecca Lawson outside the farmhouse. Claire originally planned for Rebecca to sell the property after her death if maintaining it became impossible. Rebecca walked slowly around the land beside me, clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "You'd get a very strong price for this place," she said. "Developers have been looking at farmland all through this county." I stared toward the porch where Noah sat beside Ruth beneath a blanket, despite the warm weather. "Developers," I repeated quietly. Rebecca followed my gaze. "Oh," she said gently. "I didn't realize he was still living here." Still living here. The wording bothered me immediately, as though Noah were temporary, as though this farmhouse wasn't the only real home he had ever known. That evening after dinner, I sat beside Noah on the porch while Ruth cleaned dishes inside. Crickets filled the fields beyond the driveway, and somewhere far away, thunder rolled softly across the horizon. I unfolded the newspaper and began reading aloud. Halfway through an article about rising property taxes, Noah suddenly became agitated. His breathing quickened. His fingers tightened against the wheelchair armrests. Ruth stepped onto the porch immediately. "He heard us talking earlier," she said quietly. About what? The facility. My chest tightened painfully. Noah looked directly at me then. Fear. Not confusion. Not discomfort. Fear. For 36 years, this farmhouse had been his entire world. Every doorway, every sound, every routine belonged to him. And suddenly I understood something with terrible clarity. If I walked away now, I would not only lose Claire again, Noah would lose the last remaining piece of her, too. Late that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring into darkness for nearly an hour before finally whispering the truth aloud. I can't abandon him. The next morning, I called my cousin Tyler. You still interested in buying the business? I asked. There was silence on the line. Then Tyler said carefully, Yeah? Why? I looked through the kitchen window toward Noah, sitting peacefully on the porch beneath the morning sun. Because, I answered quietly, I think I'm moving. The first night I officially moved into the farmhouse, I barely slept. Not because the house felt unfamiliar anymore, because it suddenly felt important. My entire life in Madison disappeared in less than 3 weeks. Tyler bought the appliance repair business exactly the way we agreed. A young couple expecting their first child purchased the ranch house in Brookfield Heights. By the end of October, almost everything I owned fit into the back of my truck and the small trailer attached behind it. Ruth stood on the porch the afternoon I arrived with the last load of boxes. You're really doing this, she said quietly. I looked toward Noah, sitting beside the living room window, watching my truck pull into the driveway. Yeah, I answered. I think I am. Noah made the soft sound that now carried immediate meaning to me. Happy. The strange thing about caring for another human being full-time is how quickly your body begins reorganizing itself around their needs. Within a month, my mornings no longer belonged entirely to me. I woke at 6, started coffee, prepared Noah's medications exactly the way Ruth taught me, helped transfer him carefully from bed to wheelchair using the mechanical lift installed beside his room. The first few times terrified me. Noah weighed far less than a healthy grown man should have, but cerebral palsy made every movement delicate. One wrong shift could hurt him badly. Slow, Ruth reminded me patiently one morning while I struggled with the straps. He gets nervous if you rush. I'm trying, I know. Eventually, my hands learned. That became the pattern of the entire winter. My hands learned how to steady Noah's shoulders while feeding him soup, how to understand the different sounds he made during baseball games, how to position blankets beneath his knees when cold weather stiffened his muscles, how to sit quietly beside him during difficult nights without speaking too much. And slowly, Noah began trusting me completely. One snowy afternoon in December, I found an old cardboard box hidden in the upstairs closet beside Claire's office. Inside were journals. Dozens of them. Claire's handwriting covered every page. I carried one downstairs and opened it carefully while Noah slept beside the fireplace. December 14th. Ethan asked me tonight why I seem sad after my trips east. I almost told him everything. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to so badly my chest hurt afterward. I turned another page. April 3rd. Noah laughed today listening to the recording of Ethan singing along terribly to the radio in the garage. I wish Ethan knew how much Noah already loves him. Another page. September 21st. Sometimes I watch Ethan sleeping and wonder if honesty after this many years would destroy him. I hate myself for even asking that question. By the time I closed the journal, my hands were shaking. Every page carried the same pattern. Love, fear, guilt, over and over again. That night, after Ruth and Marlene went to the cabin behind the farmhouse, I sat alone in the dark living room beside Noah's wheelchair while snow fell quietly beyond the windows. You know, I said softly, toward the framed photograph of Claire beside the fireplace. "You really messed up." Noah looked toward me immediately. I laughed once, under my breath. "She should have trusted me, huh?" Noah made a quiet sound. Then, unexpectedly, he reached toward me again. This time, there was less hesitation in the movement. I took his hand automatically. His fingers tightened gently around mine. For several seconds, the farmhouse remained completely silent, except for the soft crackling of firewood. And in that silence, something shifted inside me. Permanently. Not obligation, not pity, family. The realization frightened me a little because of how natural it suddenly felt. Noah leaned his head slowly against my shoulder. I stared out at the snow-covered fields beyond the porch, while emotion tightened painfully in my throat. Then very quietly, so softly I almost didn't recognize my own voice, I whispered into the dark farmhouse, "You're not alone anymore." By spring, the farmhouse no longer felt like Claire's secret. It felt like home. The mornings developed rhythms I could follow without thinking. Coffee brewing before sunrise. Noah's medications lined carefully across the kitchen counter. The sound of birds gathering near the maple tree beside the porch, while mist rolled slowly over the fields beyond the driveway. There were days when peace settled over the farmhouse so completely that I almost forgot how everything began. Then grief would return without warning. Sometimes it arrived while folding Noah's blankets. Sometimes while hearing one of Claire's favorite songs playing unexpectedly on the radio. And sometimes it came in the form of anger sharp enough to leave me standing motionless in the middle of the kitchen. One afternoon in April, I found myself staring at the old journals again, while Noah slept in the living room beside an open window. I opened randomly to a page near the middle. "If Ethan ever discovers the truth after I'm gone, I hope he hates me less than I hate myself for keeping it from him." The sentence hit me like a punch. Before I realized what I was doing, I slammed the journal shut, hard enough to wake Noah. Immediately, guilt flooded through me. Noah startled easily around sudden noises. "I'm sorry," I whispered, kneeling beside him. But the anger remained, not at Noah, at Claire, at the years lost, at the possibility that my wife spent 23 years assuming I was too weak to love her completely. That evening, after Noah fell asleep, Ruth found me sitting alone on the porch, staring out toward the dark pasture. "You're angry again," she said quietly. I let out a tired laugh. "Is it that obvious?" "Yes." She sat beside me without another word for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question that had been poisoning me for months. Why didn't she trust me enough? Ruth folded her hands together slowly. "You still think this was about trust? What else would it be?" She looked toward the farmhouse windows glowing softly behind us. "Fear changes people, Ethan. Especially fear carried for decades." I shook my head. "She should have known I would stay." "You know that now," Ruth replied gently. "But Claire became a mother at 16 years old while being told her life was ruined. People who survive that kind of shame don't think normally about love anymore." The words settled heavily between us. Ruth continued quietly. "Claire wasn't hiding from you. She was trapped inside a promise she made before she was old enough to understand what lifelong fear does to a person." I stared into the darkness. For the first time, I stopped measuring Claire's choices against what I would have done. Instead, I tried imagining what it must have felt like to carry that secret from age 16 until death. The loneliness of it, the exhaustion, the constant terror of losing the only stable thing she ever built. 3 days later, I drove alone to the small Lutheran church in Stone Creek Claire used to pass on her monthly trips east. The church sat exactly where Ruth said it would. White wooden siding, narrow stained glass windows, tiny cemetery behind the building. I went inside. The sanctuary was empty, except for soft afternoon light spilling across the pews. I sat alone near the back for almost an hour. No prayers, no speeches, just Silence. And somewhere inside that silence, something inside me finally loosened. Claire had lied to me. That would always hurt. But she had also spent 36 years carrying responsibility, guilt, motherhood, fear, and shame, almost entirely alone. And despite all of it, she still found ways to love me. The realization broke the last remaining piece of anger inside me. When I returned to the farmhouse that evening, Noah was sitting beside the fireplace while Ruth prepared dinner. He saw me and immediately made the soft sound that meant happiness. I smiled before I could stop myself. Then I carried the framed photograph from Claire's office into the living room. It was the only picture I could find containing all three of us. Claire stood beside my chair during a company picnic years earlier, while I laughed at something outside the frame. In the background, barely visible unless someone looked carefully, Noah sat beneath a shaded pavilion beside Ruth. For 20 years, I never noticed him there. I placed the photograph carefully on the mantel above the fireplace. Family. Complete at last. 1 year after I first opened the farmhouse door, I woke before sunrise to the sound of rain tapping softly against the kitchen windows. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I heard Noah's familiar morning sound from down the hallway, followed by the creaking floorboards of Ruth beginning her day in the kitchen, and everything settled back into place. Home. I never expected that word to belong to this farmhouse. Not after the way I first arrived here, carrying anger, confusion, and grief heavy enough to hollow a man out from the inside. Yet somewhere between winter storms, early morning medications, baseball games on the radio, and quiet evenings on the porch, the farmhouse stopped feeling like Claire's hidden world. It became ours. The routines no longer felt difficult. They felt natural. I knew exactly how Noah liked his oatmeal cooled before breakfast. I knew which blankets irritated his skin and which music calmed him during thunderstorms. I knew the difference between the sound he made when he was frustrated and the one he made when he felt safe. Most importantly, I no longer needed Ruth to translate every emotion for me. That realization came quietly on a warm Saturday morning in late spring, the third Saturday of the month. Claire's day. Sunlight stretched across the porch, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the open screen door. Noah sat beside me in his wheelchair, wrapped in the blue blanket Claire used for years during cool mornings. Ruth watered flowers near the porch railing, while Marlene prepared lunch inside. The world felt still in the gentle way rural mornings sometimes feel. I unfolded the newspaper and began reading aloud. Halfway through an article about rising corn prices, Noah suddenly made a soft, excited sound and turned his head toward the road. At the exact same moment, I heard it. A school bus engine approaching from down the county road. The yellow bus slowed near the neighboring farmhouse 2 driveways away, exactly like it did every weekday morning. Children climbed aboard while their mother waved from the porch. Noah watched the entire scene carefully. Then he made the sound again. Happiness, recognition, routine. I smiled automatically. That's the sound he always made for the school bus, Ruth said softly beside me. Claire loved listening to it. I looked at Noah, and suddenly I understood something that nearly brought tears to my eyes. For 23 years, while I sat in Madison believing Claire was simply running errands once a month, she had been here, living this life beside her son, reading newspapers on this porch, watching school buses pass, listening to the same sounds of cattle and wind and gravel roads, carrying motherhood silently while the rest of the world knew her only as my quiet wife. Noah turned toward me then. The morning sunlight caught his gray-green eyes, Claire's eyes, and for the first time since her death, the sight no longer filled me only with grief. It filled me with gratitude too, because somehow, despite all the fear and secrecy and damage surrounding the beginning of this story, Claire still left me something extraordinary. She left me Noah. I reached over and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders carefully. "You know," I said quietly, "your mother would have liked this morning." Noah made the soft sound again and rested his head gently against the side of the wheelchair. The breeze moved through the maple trees surrounding the porch. Somewhere out beyond the fields, church bells rang faintly through the morning air. I picked up the newspaper again and continued reading while Noah listened beside me peacefully. And for the first time in a very long while, I understood something simple and true. Love does not disappear when the person carrying it dies. Sometimes it survives inside the life they protected for someone else. Sometimes it survives in a farmhouse at the end of a gravel road. And sometimes, if you are lucky enough to finally understand it, love gives you a second family after you thought you had already lost everything.